Washington Post.
I missed it, but I was running around. Uh,
All right.
Hello, and welcome to Mentally Healthy Nation podcast, a special live in-person episode regarding health equity around racial trauma, politics, and school performance. The name of our show is Seen, Not Heard. I am your host, Rawle Andrews Jr., the Executive Director of the American Psychiatric Association Foundation. And again, it's a privilege to welcome you to our show. We are joined today by two esteemed guests The first is my teammate and colleague here at the APA, Dr. Regina James, MD, as well as Dr. Michael Fauntroy. We will introduce them momentarily. But before we do, let me begin by saying, if you don't remember anything else you see or hear from today's podcast, it shouldn't hurt to be a child. It shouldn't hurt to be a child. In the 1969 decision of the United States Supreme Court Tinker versus Des Moines, it was declared in a landmark decision that students do not check their rights at the schoolhouse gates. Notwithstanding the 1969 landmark decision of Tinker versus Des Moines, we are seeing our schools, our colleges, and our universities grapple and struggle with the ways in which they are impacting, directly or indirectly, the mental health and well-being of our children when they don't acknowledge or address the policies, the practices, and procedures that are harming our children. Again, it should not hurt to be a child. We are all aware, or should be aware, of so-called zero tolerance policies. These zero tolerance policies have led to an alarming rate of students who are suspended or removed from school altogether when help from a mental health professional was needed instead of intervention by a school resource officer. 70%, an alarming 70% of law enforcement referrals and arrests made in America's schools are for African American, Black, and Hispanic Latino students. 70%, 7 in 10. And a majority of our schools, despite the great and growing awareness of mental health and mental health services and supports, seem to be ill-equipped to understand how racial traumas are besieging our students, even though, because they spend the most time with our students during the school day, they're in the best position to get equipped to help provide services and supports to promote the well-being and the future advancement of our students. So during today's Mental Health Nation podcast, we'll listen to a candid conversation on, one, how racial trauma might show up in our schools; two, how our communities can begin to address racial trauma; and three, what can we do to offer our children and their family caregivers some of the services and supports they deserve. Without any further ado, let me introduce, first of all, again, my teammate, Dr. Regina James, MD. She is the Deputy Medical Director of the APA, but she's also the Chief of the Division of Diversity and Health Equity. Among other roles that Regina has enjoyed over a 25-year career include being a Senior Vice President at 2M Clinical, some work that she did with the National Institute of Minority Mental Health and Health Disparities at a leadership level, her work as Director of Office of Health Equity in the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Institute, as well as her work on child and adolescent psychiatry issues, where she has expertise in the DSM-5. So Dr. James will be our host. Regina, thank you so much for giving up your time to be the moderator for today's program. And then you're going to be joined by another good friend of APA and the APA Foundation, Dr. Michael K. Fauntroy, who's the Associate Professor of Policy and Government and the founding director of Race, Politics, and Policy Center at the George Mason University in Virginia. This is his second stint at George Mason. He spent 8 years on faculty at Howard University as the acting director of the Ron Walters Leadership and Public Policy Center before he had his own homecoming and came back to George Mason during 2021. He's the author of 2 books, Republicans and the Black Vote, as well as the Forward Magazine Book of the Year about home rule and house rule in the District of Columbia. You name a show or a publication in the public square, whether it's CNN, Huffington Post, New York Daily News, Washington Times, New York Times, Chicago Defender, etc. Dr. Fauntroy has been there, and he is our special guest today. So we ask that you receive Regina James, MD, and Michael K. Fauntroy, Ph.D., for what I know will be a courageous and a very timely conversation on seen, not heard. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, my colleague, Mr. Andrews, and thank you really for bringing the both of us together during this not only interesting time, but the month that we happen to have this conversation in Black History Month, which I think is very timely to have this during this time. So, Mr. Fauntroy, or Dr. Fauntroy.
You can go with Mike.
Okay, Michael and Regina.
Yeah.
All righty. So the title, It Should Not Hurt to Be a Child, thinking about that in the school context. I just want to share a couple of words to sort of serve as a platform for our discussion. So when I thought about it should not hurt to be a child, I thought about sort of how people perceive misbehaviors, like when kids are in school, taking misbehavior as something way out of the norm as opposed to something that is actually a part of normal development. Remember your 2-year-old, the terrible twos and the no, no, no. Some may look at that as misbehavior, but it is actually a part of normal development, or your adolescent when they're learning to be more independent and going through a lot of social and physical changes. And they like to challenge you on certain things. That's not necessarily misbehaving. That's part of normal development. But what happens when these perceptions of normal development go awry? And I think that really lays the foundation as we think about our kids in school and how they're perceived and what happens to them when they quote unquote misbehave, and what trajectory that sort of sends them down in terms of their life trajectory. I'm wondering if you maybe could touch upon, and I know my colleague, Mr. Andrews, sort of introduced the topic of the zero tolerance policy, because I think that really undergirds a lot of what we're going to really get deeper into later on.
So, well, first, thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation. I'm bringing to this conversation a background in public policy and also as a parent. You were talking about the terrible twos earlier. My wife and I have 14-year-old twins, and I wonder sometimes if it's the terrible 12s or the terrible 13. But one of the things that I've learned, and I know you know this through your medical training and your observations over time, is that human development is remarkably consistent. If you're talking about a 2-year-old in the United States or a 2-year-old in Africa or a 2-year-old in Australia, there are a lot of similarities that their behavior will present. And it's, to your point, it's really all about human development. And so for me, when I think about zero tolerance policies, they strike me as a bit of an overreaction to what we understand to be normal human development. We understand that children need guardrails. Children need to know, how to fail and how to succeed. But the adults around those kids also have to have an understanding of normal human development and a recognition of the fundamental humanity of children. So our friend Rawle Andrews in his introduction noted that 70% of arrests made of kids in schools is of Black and brown kids. That is an obscene number in my view, and in many respects reflects a lack of understanding of the fundamental humanity and of children and their natural human development. So we understand that these zero tolerance policies in schools sort of followed the zero tolerance policies that we saw at the national public policy level in terms of getting tough on crime in the late 80s and the early 90s, and 3 strikes and some of these other kinds of things where public policy makers concluded that we can just sort of incarcerate our way out of whatever problems we think are in our communities. That, of course, has been proven false, but it makes some people feel comfortable that we're being tough on these incorrigible kids. But as you know, this is in many ways a part of normal human development, and the boundaries that exist for some kids in the normal human development don't exist for others. And for me, that is at the crux of what is going on here. How do we create a public policy regime that allows all kids and all people to go as far as their ambition and ability will take them? And when we have these zero tolerance policies that take a hammer to a gnat and certain kinds of things, we get in the way of that ambition and push down the ceiling on that ability.
Exactly. And Michael, what I find really fascinating is really sort of the history or the trajectory of how we've handled behavior or misbehaviors in the schools. I know that in my time, well, I won't say when that was, corporal punishment was not off the table. I mean, corporal punishment has been around since the late 1800s, and has moved on into the 1950s. And that was really how they handled behaviors in school. And then they went toward the exclusionary discipline process, right? So if you're misbehaving in school, then you will be, expelled from the class or expelled from the school. So that was like around the 1960s. And then they moved to, as you have pointed out, and Rawle have pointed out as well, more on that zero tolerance. Now, what I find fascinating about the zero tolerance piece is and correct me if I'm wrong as a policy expert, it seemed to have started out focused on guns, and then it morphed into zero tolerance as it relates to like drug and alcohol and violence. And then it morphed into zero tolerance as it related to behaviors. And that's when we started to see sort of the difference in terms of how kids were disciplined and how the zero tolerance policy was implemented. And we started to see that difference between Black and brown kids and other kids. And that's the interesting part to me.
Mm-hmm.
How we have basically morphed the zero tolerance policy into something that is, I guess, more convenient for some without taking into consideration child development.
Right. So it's a pendulum, right? So you were talking about corporal punishment. I was in a conversation just yesterday with a colleague of mine who was talking about the ruler on the knuckles in school growing up. And what struck me about that conversation was he remembered it so vividly to this day. And as you move the pendulum to exclusionary punishment, let's put you in detention, let's, let you have lunch by yourself, that kind of thing, and then to this current zero tolerance regime. The one consistent thing in all of these different circumstances is the only one who's hurt is the child.
Exactly.
The only one. And it is done in some respects out of convenience. Now, we should also note that there is a stark difference in some ways between what goes on in public schools versus what may go on in private or independent or parochial schools. There seems to be, and I'm using this a bit advisedly, there seems to be more flexibility in certain private and independent schools than there are in public schools. And my fear is that we're losing or have lost an understanding of the fundamental purpose of school, which is to educate kids. Now, we understand that you can't have kids being disruptive in classes. But to Rawle's earlier point about resources and resource personnel in schools, the budget cuts that have affected so many school systems around the country has taken out of the building some of those people who could be useful
Mm-hmm.
to provide support for some of those kids that may have just had a tough weekend and weren't in the right frame of mind on Monday or Tuesday, or kids that came to school hungry, or for whatever reason weren't their best selves.
Exactly.
And so one of my sort of fundamental questions here is, as a school system, uh, what kind of investments do you think are necessary to get the most success for your kids? You hear legislators and politicians all around the country talk about public-private partnerships and investing money to help make the community more attractive. But you never hear them, or rarely hear them, talking about that in the context of schools,
Right.
school systems. What is it that we can do to make our school system the best in this region so that everybody wants to be here and do business here and live and spend money here?
No,
And so,
you're
and so,
absolutely right.
so as I see it, these zero tolerance policies and this pendulum that I referred to earlier actually are counterproductive. They don't help the child. In fact, they hurt the child, and could potentially have long-term implications down the line if this child happens to be unlucky enough to be in a school system that is less accommodating and less willing to accept certain behaviors as part of human development, and rather see them as threatening and the kinds of things that need to be punished rather than supported.
Right. And research does support exactly what you said in terms of expelling these kids from school, the harsh punishments down the line, introducing them to the juvenile justice system early down the line has negative consequences. It actually is counterproductive to what one is hoping to do, which I'm assuming is keeping the safe school and doing what's best for the child. Ultimately, it is not what's best for the child, and research studies support that. That does not happen. Ultimately, at the end of the day,
Mhm. So
another thing.
can I jump in on that quickly?
Oh, sure. Mhm.
It's bad for the child. It's terrible for the child. We understand that. But we have to always remember that politics results in policies that impact people, right? So when you have politicians who are just as focused, who are more focused on their own reelection than they are in creating public policy that positively impacts the lives of the people in their communities, and instead are just focused on the next election, they're not prepared in many ways to make the nuanced arguments for the need for greater investments in certain kinds of educational endeavors. And as a result, we end up with a public policy regime that punishes children, and the people in those communities, the business owners in particular, are similarly hurt in many ways, don't understand or recognize that all this means is that you're going to have fewer future employees from which to choose. Okay, and this is one of the fundamental defects in the way we do education, in the way we do rehabilitation for those people who need it, who are incarcerated, who are returning citizens, for example. We don't do a good enough job of that, in part because the politicians are more interested in reelection and putting together public policies that will support their reelection than they are putting together public policies that will support people.
Right, and I think about that issue about, the focus on the public policy piece, and you brought up an important point. It depends on the argument that you make to policymakers in terms of, does it stick? So you mentioned the part about future employment. You're talking about the bottom line, the dollar, future employment. Does that resonate with, the public policymakers versus it's just morally and ethically the right thing to do for the child? That may or may not,
Right.
stick.
Yeah, so the moral and ethically right thing, as you and I probably agree, this is um, takes a back seat to political expediency, quite frankly, right? And it's easier to scare people in support of your reelection than it is to sort of magnetize people with public policy. The reality is, I don't want to get anybody in trouble here, but I just want to say
No one's on the line.
reason
No
why
one's on the
this is not attributed to the American Psychiatric Association Foundation. I think we have a militantly ignorant public electorate who is driven by fear rather than hope. And as a consequence, it's easier to tap into fear than it is to tap into hope, which is why so many politicians try to tap into voters on things that make them fearful rather than things that make them hopeful.
Mm.
And so our overarching political policy ecosystem right now is really problematic because some people don't see the connect between a well-educated, mentally healthy, and engaged universe of students and how that will result in a better educated, more talented, more flexible, and greater employment pool for business owners in the out years. And it's painful for me because there's so many young people, and I see this all the time on college campuses. There are tons of talented young people, but they're on college campuses. But there are also tons of talented people who are not on college campuses. And that, that's a whole other conversation and part about how we finance our education system. But there's a lot of talent out there that's not being fully nurtured, in part because of public policy decisions, including the zero tolerance ones that we've been talking about these last few minutes.
Right, right. Now, another thing I think that really bothers me is, we started off talking about, the interpretation of behavior of children. Is it misbehaving? Is it really out of the bell curve? Is it out of the norm? And how do you deal with behaviors in school, etc.? Then I also think about the, children, under 18, it's about, I don't know, 1 in 6 kids who have an underlying like mental health issue, whether it's anxiety or depression or something like that. And they haven't been diagnosed. And so what they exhibit on the outside, one may interpret as misbehavior, when in fact they have an underlying medical illness that can be diagnosed and treated, and that child could live a full and healthy life. And so thinking about the many kids who do have an underlying mental illness and have not been made aware of it, whether they're underinsured or uninsured, just haven't been diagnosed or whatever, in a school system demonstrating these behaviors and somehow get funneled into, through these school referrals, the juvenile justice system.
Mm-hmm. So you just hit on something that is a significant hole in American education. So if 1 in 6, and I wouldn't be surprised if the number was larger, right?
Mm-hmm.
If 1 in 6 have some underlying condition that's not seen and not heard,
Thank you.
I could use that phraseology. If it's dyslexia, which makes academic performance more difficult, if it's anxiety, if it's ADHD, if it's a variety of, as you rightly pointed out, treatable conditions, but school systems aren't trained to identify those conditions and certainly don't want to expend the resources necessary to provide that support, then that child is more likely to be engaged in the system in a way that is problematic. So I'm, as you, being a parent sort of reintroduces you to your younger self, and often I've been, as my wife and I are going through this journey with our own kids, you see kids in their schools and talk to parents and hear their stories, and I reflect on my own experiences growing up in Washington, D.C., attending D.C. public schools from kindergarten through 12th grade, and thinking about so many kids that I grew up, particularly Black boys, who, as the years went on, became more engaged in the criminal justice system. And then as a parent looking back on that, I'm wondering, so and so, that kid was pretty smart. I wonder if there had been some underlying condition
Mm-hmm.
that had not been identified, that had it been identified, perhaps could have changed the trajectory of this kid's life.
Exactly.
And so we have all sorts of things that are not being done. And then we are effectively penalizing the child for things that adults didn't do, who in many cases had the capacity to do and didn't. And in some cases, had indifference to the student's needs and
Mm-hmm.
didn't take the extra step to make it happen. That, we know that from a public policy perspective, states around the country look at reading and test scores in third and fourth grade to try to project
Mm-hmm.
how many prison beds they're going to need down the line, which is frightening in many ways to think about. But from a public policy perspective, if those dollars had been rerouted to early childhood education, for example, and identifying kids who need a little extra support, perhaps you wouldn't need that money for prisons, and could use that money for more community investment to help create young people that can be better balanced and um, more attractive as future employees for
Mm-hmm.
businesses in their own communities.
And my other question is, today, why do you think there are more, police officers in schools? Schools are more willing to invest in police officers in the school than psychologists or any other mental health person in the school.
Well, that gets back to a point I was making earlier. So voters, citizens, have not yet caught up to the notion that a school is about more than just the teachers in the classroom. It's all the adults in the building. And what kind of message do you want to send to communities? So 30 years ago, a lot of public schools in this city had a handful of adults on the payroll who would walk the halls and sort of mentor kids
Mm-hmm.
indirectly or informally and just be there. Okay. And so belts got tightened. Those folks got moved out of those jobs. And we saw an increase in ineffectual or behaviors that we don't want to see.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than respond by putting those people back in the schools, we instead decide that the answer actually is police in the schools. And think about the message that sends to a first grader, a second grader, kids that are not, no second grader, no first grader, right? Anywhere in the country is developed enough to understand any of the nuance around that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're teachers and police officers. And that's it. Now, some schools you got coaches, and this is where athletics and arts and those sorts of things become so fundamental, in my view, to the 360-degree education that all of our kids deserve.
Mm-hmm.
But the placing of police officers in these spaces, in my view, it presents a false sense of security for the kids, but more importantly for the parents. Because the parents, all parents want safe spaces for the kids. I want that. Parents who are watching us right now want that. But in some respects, having police in the building may provide a false sense of that.
Right, right. And as I think about sort of the, I guess, differential rates of suspension, like, more Black and brown kids are suspended at higher rates. The teachers or whoever the school officials are who are sort of, making this evaluation on this misbehavior and, basically making recommendations to the juvenile justice system, et cetera. One of the pieces I'll often think about, and I think research supports as well, is what's known as adultification bias, which is essentially like for Black boys, if they misbehave, it was intentional. They knew what they were doing. It has nothing to do with sort of their developmental stage, and that's not taken into consideration. It's more intentional. They know what they were doing. Same with Black girls.
Mhm.
They put the values or the criteria of being an adult on a younger person, and so therefore it skews their view about whether this behavior is appropriate or not. Tends to be not appropriate, hence referral to juvenile justice system.
Yeah. And by the way, if I could just hang one more part to that, there's all kind of research that shows that as it pertains to Black boys, white jurors think that Black boys are older than they actually are. And so, that's something that resonates with me with a 14-year-old son who's going through a growth spurt right now, and he's got a little bit of a mustache, and you know, and again, parenting introduces you to your younger self. I'm now seeing it through the eyes of my parents, who probably worried about me just going out to the store to play basketball or just to hang out. What happens if a police officer comes across my son and his boys and assumes that they're older than they actually are, or treats them as if they're older than they actually are, and doesn't really understand the development side. I am deeply concerned about that. And by the way, that misunderstanding of the age of a Black child, a Black boy in particular, makes it easier for people to accept charging children as adults for certain kinds of crimes. We understand that mens rea is about 25 when the brain fully forms. So why are we holding 15 and 16-year-old? Why are we charging them as adults when they are a long way from fully developing their brains to make the kinds of cognitive decisions that we would expect for an adult to make? By the way, as you know, some adults get it wrong.
Right.
But we're holding kids to standards that they're not sort of developmentally able to make.
It's not fair. And I resonate with you. I too have two children. My son, who's now 23, went through all of what you're going through now. He is, as I always say, he's tall. And so he was, always taller. And I'm seeing something that I'm not sure what I'm looking at. But anyway, he's taller, and so always concerned about how people perceived him, always worried about, when he went out, and, he's 23 now, even more taller, a tall, intelligent, handsome young man. But the world has this adultification bias. They've always seen him as older, and anything that he would do in school would be seen as more intentional. And, it was very difficult and for me to always have these conversations with him, that it's not the same.
Yeah, and so you know that there's this thing called the talk, and there is these conversations that we have to have with our kids around these kinds of things. and we try not to put too much on our kids. Or when our kids were 12, I was part of a group of Black dads who took our Black sons to meet with a Black police officer to give them some tips on how to handle being pulled over by police. You know, show your hands, turn on all the lights in the car, and such. And we did it because we understood that that's the world we live in. And while it's entirely too heavy for a 12-year-old, in my view, to have to do this, you know, we also are trying to protect our kids with this adultification of children, of kids. And as we think about how this sort of resonates in public policy, does it impact public policy or does public policy impact it? More often than not, these things tend to be cyclical.
Yeah.
I am deeply concerned about this adultification and how we react, or in some respects, overreact to it. Kids are kids. You know, some kids have problems. I'm not sitting there trying to suggest to you that they don't. And I'm not sitting here trying to suggest to you that some of these problems aren't deadly serious. But all kids deserve leeway to, again, go as far as their ambition and ability will take them. And when we overreact with zero tolerance policies, we hold down some of their ceiling on what they can do going forward.
Absolutely agree. And some even go so far as to say, not only do we have an issue with school to prison, but really cradle to prison pipeline, you know.
Yeah, so, you know, it's so look, my wife and I are fortunate. You know, we've been able to provide certain opportunities and experiences to our kids, and we're proud of that. And we also count our blessings in that regard. Uh, um, but you know, the success of a child shouldn't be tied to resources in the way that it is. And so, for me, as we assess the success or failure of a society, I think we have to assess it in some respects on how it provides for its children. What opportunities, what resources is it willing to commit to make sure that kids have what they need to go as far as they can go? And so when you look at parts of our country that are over policed and undereducated and under resourced, you're right. It's not just school to prison, it's actually cradle to grave. Because, you know, if you are unfortunately caught up in the system, so to speak, and get out on the other side, what is there for you? 600,000 people leave state and federal prisons every year. And public policies have been created to make it very difficult for them to successfully re-enter society and stay out. And so food insecurity, fewer job opportunities, housing insecurity, mental health, a lack of mental health counseling and access to whatever is necessary in those spaces helps to create this vicious cycle that we're all too familiar with. And, you know, if you're coming out at age 35, having been in half your life, in some cases, what does that mean for you for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years if you're fortunate enough to live that long? So a 10, 15-year sentence at the age of 17 or 18 could essentially be a life sentence because it effectively moves your life off of a trajectory of relative success and moves it into one of increasing likelihood of real problems going forward.
Right. And my other issue is this. So, we're continuing, but we have been, dealing with the pandemic with COVID-19 for the last couple of years, essentially. And we all know that it has disproportionately impacted communities of color. We also know that, with the pandemic, a lot of kids have been, schooling from home. So this referral process of the school making the referrals to juvenile justice system has gone down because no one's in school, no one's making the referrals. My concern is now that kids are going back to school, we know that we've all been dealing with more sort of emotional lability, whether more anxious, more depressed, just it's been a very stressful time. And then, as you mentioned, adding on issues around food insecurity, people may have, job insecurity, loss of jobs, loss of family. So you have a whole host of additional stressors in addition to the stressors that were there before the pandemic. My concern is as these kids return back to school, how is the school system going to handle this? Are they going to be aware than they were before, but are they going to be aware, cognizant, and sensitive to the fact that there's even more issues that the kids are dealing with? And so the behaviors that they may see, the underlying issue is not they're just misbehaving, but there's a lot that we're all dealing with.
So I'm not optimistic about that. I think there are going to be dissertations written over the next 10 years about the impact of the pandemic on child development. I am deeply concerned with what I'm seeing with young people. And by the way, even at the university level, right? If you're a 20-year-old sophomore, you missed out on the end of your senior year in high school and all of the sort of rites of passage that come with that. You missed out on many of the rites of passage that come with your freshman year in college, because you did school from home your freshman year, right? And I am deeply worried that the additional stress and the reduced student performance, because online teaching is not as effective as in-person teaching, right? Kids, there have been many kids, and I'm sure you've seen the studies on this, who have literally tapped out of school on screen. It's not sufficiently engaging. And as you know, young people need to be engaged, particularly those who have, and we talked about this earlier, some of these underlying conditions, be it dyslexia or dysgraphia or ADHD or anxiety. Many kids in that group really do respond better to hands-on in-person learning. So they now come back to school having missed out on a year plus of in-person hands-on learning, which means that they may well be in the 7th or 8th grade, but they've actually done the learning of somebody who is in the 6th or 7th grade or 5th grade. And what does that mean as we go forward for their own educational development and ability to be competitive in the workforce when they graduate high school or when they graduate college? So I'm worried, and my fear is that we're going to see dropout rates over the course of the next few years explode because we have at least a 2-year period in which there have been numerous schools that haven't been able to open. And even as we seem to be getting closer to the end of the Omicron variant, there's still schools that are having to shut down and close, and the impact that has on family calendars. And you can't just, school shuts down on Wednesday, and what does a parent do when they have to go to work? And so I have to confess to being deeply worried about that right now.
So what about maybe on an upswing, the concept of restorative justice in schools? and how we can deal with engaging families, particularly, families of color, in the educational community more intentionally, engaging the students and working together more intentionally. What are your thoughts on the restorative justice in schools?
So I think every public school in America, in addition to some of the resource people, should have sort of full-time staff dedicated to events management who can coordinate and organize events that build community among the parents in those schools. We see some of that with school athletics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big believer in school athletics. I think it helps to build community among the students and among their families. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's really important. But the most cohesive and successful school communities are also those that are most engaged in
Mm-hmm.
some kind of community building activities. Now we get that everybody can't do everything,
Right.
but then we need more of that. You know, schools are a reflection of the communities in which they are situated, and cohesive communities tend to have cohesive schools. And I think the idea of community is really important to me from a public policy standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that well-organized communities are best able to get out of the political process what they need to be their best selves.
Right. And I'm thinking about the kids, when they do go back after dealing with all of these stressors. Um, and as you say, from an academic standpoint, they may not be where they were. And as a matter of fact, they may have fallen behind. Behaviors are a little bit, a little more escalated than before. What can we do, I guess, to address some of these? What can we do to address some of these issues, some of these, the underlying problems, even the underlying biases that were there
Right.
before? And it's and as we talked about throughout today, the Black and brown kids are being disproportionately impacted by all of this.
Mm.
How do you begin to have those discussions or have teachers feel comfortable with discussions about race, racism, the impact and biases and how that can impact, the school environment, child development, all of that in light of, I guess, or with the backdrop of some of the fallout that's coming around, not having certain books in the school and not necessarily discussing race and racism in schools. So you kind of have these two things coming together at the same time when it seems like this issue is needed most to have these discussions.
Yeah, so that gets to a much broader issue about sort of civic education in America. So everybody who's watching us right now likely has heard of the concept critical race theory. It is a theory that has been around in American legal education for decades. And it is one that has been badly misused for political purposes and is now being used as cover to push back against even the sort of watered down Black History Month programs that we see at schools around the country. Can't talk about slavery, can't talk about segregation. That's critical race theory. That's bad, right? So I'm a big believer in the power of information and the power of education. And that's more difficult in an environment in which some people are purposely misinforming and purposely miseducating. But I think that's where it starts. Voices who know better have to speak up and engage in this public dialogue and this public discourse, which I believe has been badly corroded over the years, in which there are some people who actually believe that 2 + 2 is 5 in many respects, because they've been so badly misinformed about what's going on in the world. And so, with regard to the issue of race and racism, I really do think that we have to be vigilant on this, because there are some people that want to redefine race and racism, with Black and brown people being those who are committing the race and racism against others. So I would believe that it starts with sort of community-based information and education and community dialogue around these kinds of things. Now that's hard to do. People are busy and have so much going on.
Mhm.
I'm not naive to that, but I don't see a better way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about that as, when I think about maybe some ways to improve this sort of, whether you say school to prison pipeline or cradle to prison pipeline, is really about, awareness, knowledge, um, having some sort of, curriculum involved in the school to really openly discuss and talk about these issues, some sort of teacher training so that they could feel more comfortable and empowered and knowledgeable to talk about and to implement some of these sort of interactive, opportunities with parents and engaging the community more, things of that nature.
So, oh, but Regina,
I'm just,
I'm with you on that. But but we probably agree that in most parts of the country, people don't really care about that in the way that you and I probably want to see it. You can do all the teacher and administrative training you want, but if it's not in them to care, it's not going to result in the kinds of things that you and I probably want to see. Now, I know for a fact that there are plenty of people that do care. There are plenty of people in schools who see young people with potential that need nurturing environments. I mean, all kids need nurturing environments, right? Um, but I also think that many teachers sort of feel under siege right now,
Mhm.
you know. And I would like to see a circumstance in which it's not on the teachers as much as there may be other people in the buildings that can help lead that part of it, and leave the teaching to the teachers, because my view is, in many ways, the teachers are just sort of overrun in many
That's
schools.
true.
And I would like to relieve some of that pressure they feel. I know a lot of K through 12 teachers, and depending on where they are in the country, it's a rough go right now for them.
And I agree. And I was just thinking teachers because it seems like they're the ones who are making these referrals around misbehaviors and what's going on in the classroom and, these
Well,
exclusionary disciplinary actions.
they may be making the initial referral, but for it to get out of the school, it's got to go through a principal somewhere. But I hear you. It's a real dilemma. It really
Yeah,
is. My only hesitancy is that we're requiring teachers to do so much now
you're right.
that they, and this gets back to something you mentioned earlier, that we need more resources in the building, more people in the building who can help address some of these concerns, so these referrals don't need to be made,
Right.
or that there are some alternatives that can be created so that these referrals do not need to be made.
And it's interesting, we made the switch from, the corporal punishment that was around for a while to exclusionary discipline. We've made the switch from the various formats of what zero tolerance is. Research supports that zero tolerance does not work. When are we going to try a new approach?
when we get leadership in place that's willing to say publicly that zero tolerance doesn't work, when we get, and when those educational leaders have the support of the various county and city councils and state legislatures around the country, because those are the ones who are pushing to have these zero tolerance policies in the first place. And when communities are willing to accept that very truth that you just mentioned, it's so much easier to go zero tolerance. There's no nuance in that. People want black and white, on and off solutions. When you and I both know that child rearing, whether it's in terms of mental health, academics, arts, athletics, in that gumbo that is education, there's a lot of gray space in between those two, and that's where the gumbo is made. And unfortunately, we're not at a place right now where our public discourse is tolerant of nuance and context. We want easy solutions that do not exist, but we'll take the easy solutions because they make us feel good.
Well, I'm trying to close on a high note.
I was just about to say, and on that high note, no, I get it. Now, let me try this. I never cease to be amazed by the resiliency of kids. You give a kid some love, and you give a kid some opportunity and some encouragement and some guardrails so that they can make mistakes, but not run off the road and be out of the game. You'd be surprised what they can do. And so my optimism lies in my belief in kids, and that if we can just get the resources at a level that meets the kids' needs, we're going to be in a much better place.
All right. And get more mental health people in the schools and more police out of the schools. And really, hoping that the educational system, because it is one of the places that kids who have mental health issues receive counseling,
And it's one of the areas in which that is the most mysterious to parents and people who aren't engaged in education on a daily basis.
Right.
And so we tend to recoil from things that we don't understand. But I think, we need, people don't understand why it is that you have social workers in schools, but it's better to have social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists in schools for young people while they're young than it is to have to deal with that when they're older and it's more costly.
And making it more of a normative issue and not an abnormal issue, to be able to engage and have discussions and talk to mental health professionals. So I agree. Well, Dr. Fauntroy, it has truly been a pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. I've learned a lot.
Thank you.
And I hope that those who are listening have also learned a lot from this discussion. I am still hopeful. I'm still hopeful about our kids, about the future. It really will be interesting to see now that we are on the tail end, I hope, of the pandemic and kids get back into school. It'll be interesting to see how that referral goes. I'm hopeful that we will have some strategy or some approach that will help us, diminish that referral and really focus on a child being a child.
Yeah, agreed. And thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Dr. Regina James, MD. Dr. Michael K. Fauntroy, Ph.D. Want to thank you for that intellectual prescription for a better state. We want to thank you for that dissertation that gives us some components to get to a better place. At a time in Black History Month when the only certainty seems to be more uncertainty, you two have brought a morsel of clarity, a dose of healing, a dose of help, and a dose of hope when we needed it most. And we cannot thank you enough for hanging around. Because in many instances, Regina and Mike, we always talk about meeting people where they are. And then we quick to jump in the train, the plane, the automobile, and not stick around to find out what's really going on so we can meet people where they are. So one of the things I'd like to ask that you do is let's do a report card a year from now. 364 days, let's come back and let's see if the conversation that you two started today, we can now operationalize in our own lanes. And come back and do a report card, and it'll be for you, Dr. Fauntroy, post midterms. So the world gonna shift a little bit by then, and let's see how we can help some more people. Now, for our guests that were able to take time to join us today on this Mentally Healthy Nation podcast, we want to thank you so much for joining such a powerful and sobering conversation about the complexities of racial trauma and school performance. Because our guests were so kind, we have decided to share with you a little information about how you can learn more about what's happening at the American Psychiatric Association with our Deputy Medical Director and our team at APA, as well as how you can get a little more information about this beacon of hope, help, and healing at the APA Foundation. And then Dr. Fauntroy's new center on race, politics, and policy at George Mason University. All those addresses are there for you to take a look. The APA Foundation, as that beacon of healing, hope, and help, is promoting through conversations like this and the work that my teammates are putting in every day and our board is putting in every day, where we live, where we learn, where we work, where we worship, and where we play. But we cannot do it without your time. We cannot do it without your talent. And we cannot do it without your support, because the reality of it is the systems, the structures, the policies, the practices, and procedures that got us in the current state did not happen by one act of fiat. It was a collective that came together and decided this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. If we want to reverse that situation, we must reconvene and decide we don't want the status quo. We can do better. We must do better, and we will do better. But again, we have to do that together. So if you enjoyed or benefited from what you heard today from Dr. James and Dr. Fauntroy, please share this episode or any of our other episodes of Mentally Healthy Nation podcast with a friend, with a family member, and with a colleague. I am Rawle Andrews Jr. Of the APA Foundation. I want you to please take care of yourselves and your families. I want you to please take care of your communities. But if you don't do one thing else and you say, it's too much, I'm overwhelmed, I don't know where I can go, can we all just agree to hug our children a little tighter tonight? Wherever we are, just a little tighter. They may not understand why you're doing it, but it is so essential so that they have an opportunity to find out what their best life might be and get on a trajectory to start living. So again, thank you to Dr. Fauntroy, our special guest. Thank you to my teammate par excellence, Dr. Regina James, and thank all of you. Let's get out there, and we will talk to you soon.
All right. So are we clear?
We should. I don't think so.